Roughly 3 weeks ago, I had a meeting of my Ag Advisory Committee, which is made up of about 40 farmers. And I just want to stress the anxiety and the uncertainness in the ag community right now, where prices are at, where diesel has gone, fertilizer application. They're suffering now, and they're concerned about the direction that we're going.
Trump's trade strategy was supposed to protect American industry. Instead, it is hitting one of his strongest voter bases the hardest. U.S. farmers are now facing rising costs, shrinking markets, and a dependency they cannot escape. Because when it comes to keeping their crops alive, the power doesn't sit in Washington. It sits in Canada's potash fields. A recent congressional hearing on trade policy exposed more than policymakers likely intended. Lawmakers from key agricultural states did not speak in hypotheticals. They described a sector already under pressure. Farmers are dealing with falling crop prices, rising input costs, and unstable export markets. Soybean producers in particular are losing ground as China shifts demand toward Brazil and Argentina. At the same time, uncertainty surrounding the future of the USMCA agreement has raised concerns about the stability of North American trade. During the hearing, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer was asked directly what confidence he could offer farmers. His response emphasized long-term market access and new trade opportunities, but it did little to address the immediate reality farmers are facing. That reality is not abstract, it is measurable. Costs are rising faster than revenues, and the margin for error is shrinking. But the hearing missed the most important point. The real vulnerability is not what American farmers are losing, it is what they cannot operate without. Trump's tariff strategy is built on leverage, pressure trading partners, force concessions, and bring production back home. That logic works in manufacturing. It does not work in agriculture. Farmers cannot reshore soil nutrients. They cannot rebuild supply chains tied to geology. And they cannot delay planting cycles while policy plays out. Instead, tariffs are creating a mismatch. On one side, export markets are shrinking as global buyers diversify. On the other, input costs are rising due to supply disruptions and global energy volatility. This is not strategic leverage. It is structural exposure.
So, half of the world's food supply is directly attributable to fertilizer. So, fertilizer is food, right?
Yeah.
Potash is fertilizer. Then, there's only two places in the world to really get it. Here in Canada, well, Saskatchewan, or Belarus and Russia.
Wow.
And so, you only have two choices for any sizable production.
The most immediate pressure comes from inputs, especially fertilizer. Fertilizer is not optional. It is the foundation of modern farming, and in the United States, it can account for 30 to 40% of total operating costs, and those costs are surging. Recent data shows fertilizer prices rising by 25 to 40% in early 2026, driven by global supply disruptions and rising energy prices. Fuel costs have also increased sharply, in some regions by more than 40%, amplifying the pressure across every stage of production. For farmers, this creates a trap. They cannot reduce fertilizer use without sacrificing yields. A 15% drop in yield can translate into losses of $500,000 or more for a large farm in a single season. Across the U.S. agricultural system, that quickly scales into billions in lost output. What makes this pressure even more severe is how concentrated fertilizer costs have become at the field level. In 2026, average fertilizer expenses for corn are estimated at around $166 to $220 per acre, depending on region. For a 2,500-acre farm, that translates into roughly $400,000 to over $500,000 in fertilizer spending alone before harvest. If prices rise another 20%, that adds an extra $80,000 to $100,000 in cost instantly. And because grain prices remain weak, that increase comes directly out of profit, turning marginally profitable farms into break-even or loss-making operations almost overnight.
And at the center of that cost structure is potash. The United States does not produce enough potash to sustain its own agricultural needs. It relies heavily on imports, and those imports are dominated by Canada. Canada controls roughly 1/3 of global potash supply, with vast reserves concentrated in Saskatchewan. These reserves are not easily replicated. Building new mines takes years, often more than a decade, and requires billions in investment. That means U.S. farmers are not simply buying from Canada, they are dependent on Canada. And that dependency has real financial consequences. A modest increase of $50 per ton in potash prices can add $100,000 to $250,000 in additional annual costs for a mid-sized farm. Multiply that across thousands of farms, and the impact runs into billions of dollars across the sector. More importantly, there is no short-term alternative. Canada is not just part of the supply chain, it is the backbone of it. The real risk appears when supply tightens, not just prices. U.S. fertilizer inventories are already running about 25% below normal seasonal levels due to global disruptions. If Canadian potash supply were even partially constrained, for example a 10% shortfall, farmers would be forced to reduce application rates. Historical data shows that fertilizer shortages can push yields down by 10 to 20%. Applied to the U.S. corn sector, which generates over $90 billion annually, that implies potential losses of $9 to $18 billion in a single season. This is not a pricing issue, it is a system-level vulnerability tied directly to one supplier.
If this were only a North American issue, it would already be serious, but global factors are making it worse. The ongoing tensions in the Middle East, particularly around the Strait of Hormuz, are pushing energy prices higher. Since fertilizer production is energy-intensive, higher oil and gas prices directly translate into higher fertilizer costs. Global projections suggest fertilizer prices could rise another 15 to 30% in 2026 if disruptions persist. That means U.S. farmers are now exposed to a double shock. Domestic policy is increasing uncertainty, global conditions are increasing costs, and both pressures converge on the same point: fertilizer.
This is where the strategy begins to break down. Trump's tariffs were meant to create leverage by pressuring trading partners, but in agriculture, that logic doesn't hold. Farmers cannot replace key inputs or shift supply chains quickly, which means tariffs don't reduce dependence, they expose it. As costs rise and markets weaken, U.S. farmers are becoming more vulnerable, not less. And at the center of that vulnerability is a system built on inputs they don't control. Canada's position in potash is not the result of aggressive policy, but of structural advantage. What was intended to strengthen U.S. leverage is instead revealing a dependency that tariffs cannot fix, turning pressure into exposure.
The congressional hearing was meant to address farmer concerns. Instead, it revealed something deeper. U.S. farmers are not just facing a difficult economic cycle. They are operating in a system where their most critical input is controlled outside their borders, and that input is Canadian potash. If costs continue to rise and supply remains constrained, the consequences will not be theoretical. They will show up in reduced yields, falling incomes, and potentially billions of dollars in lost agricultural output, which leads to a simple question. If American farming depends on Canadian inputs to survive, who really holds the leverage? Because in this case, it is not the country imposing tariffs that holds the power. It is the country that controls what keeps the system running. And right now, that country is Canada.
Potash was the top mineral exported to the United States in 2024, largely coming from this deposit in Western Canada, with a total value of $4.2 billion.
It would be hard to imagine. Again, difficult to know exactly where President Trump will be going in this, but hard to imagine that with something like fertilizer and potash, that there would be a risk really to U.S. farmers in the context of something like this. They need our potash. It is one of the things that can't be produced in a way in the United States.
Donald Trump has just repeated the biggest trade mistake of his presidency. Except this time, the consequences are far worse. After threatening very severe tariffs on Canadian potash, analysts immediately warned that American farmers could face a new wave of bankruptcies. In 2018, Trump's tariffs on China crushed U.S. soybean exports and forced Washington to bail out farmers with billions in emergency aid. But now he's targeting fertilizer itself, the one input every crop in America depends on. This isn't just a policy error. This is Trump holding his own farmers hostage in a negotiation they never asked for. And Canada is the adult in the room watching the U.S. repeat history, only this time with even higher stakes.
The latest confrontation erupted when Trump said he was considering harsh new tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, especially potash, the mineral that fuels global food production and remains the backbone of Saskatchewan's economy. The comment came despite the fact that earlier this year, the White House was forced to scale back fertilizer duties after U.S. farmers revolted, warning that rising costs were pushing them toward insolvency. Yet here Trump is again, threatening the same sector that feeds his political base. What makes this explosive is simple. Potash isn't like steel or aluminum. The United States imports nearly 90% of its potash, and about 80% of that comes from Canada. There is no domestic alternative. Saskatchewan alone supplies more potash than the entire United States could ever produce. Scott Moe's reaction captured the absurdity. He urged calm, reminding Canadians to take the president seriously, not literally. Meanwhile, trade expert Jacques Shore stated the uncomfortable truth. America needs Canadian potash because it cannot produce enough of its own. And all of this is happening just months before the 2026 CUSMA review, a moment when cooler heads should prevail, but instead, Washington is lighting matches near dry grass.
To understand the danger of Trump's potash threat, we only need to rewind to 2018. Back then, Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on China. Beijing responded by halting purchases of U.S. soybeans, devastating farmers across the Midwest. The fallout was immediate. Prices collapsed, storage bins overflowed, and the White House had to pay tens of billions in bailout money to keep farms from failing. But the potash situation is fundamentally different and far more dangerous. If Trump hits Canadian potash, America cannot simply find another customer the way China did. There is no alternative supplier. Russia and Belarus are geopolitical non-options, and no other nation on earth can fill Canada's role. When soybeans lost an export market, farmers suffered. When fertilizers become unaffordable, crops fail. The entire U.S. food system is at risk, from grain to vegetables to livestock feed. In 2018, Trump triggered a farm crisis. In 2025, he is flirting with a food production crisis. Farmers remember the last time Trump gambled with their livelihoods. They know how that story ended, and they know that this time, the consequences will not be limited to soybeans. It will hit every acre of American soil.
Here is the most revealing part. Canada is not the one escalating. Trump is using American farmers as leverage for the upcoming CUSMA-USMCA 2026 negotiations, squeezing his own domestic base to pressure Ottawa into concessions. Canada, meanwhile, has remained steady, pragmatic, and diplomatic. Trump, by contrast, is treating American agriculture as a bargaining chip. The people who will suffer first are not politicians. It's the producers in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas, people already battling drought, rising fuel costs, and inflation. Farm groups across the Midwest have quietly, and in some cases very publicly, warned the White House that fertilizer tariffs are economically suicidal. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe said the same thing in more diplomatic language. Canada does not need to escalate because the U.S. Farm Belt will do the job for them. In other words, Trump is threatening Canada. But he is hurting Americans.
Canada's strength in this conflict comes from something simple. It didn't cause it. Canadian producers didn't start a tariff war. Canadian politicians didn't weaponize agriculture. Canada is acting like a stable trading nation, and the world sees it. Nutrien, the country's largest fertilizer company, is expanding export capacity and exploring new global routes. European and Asian buyers are lining up for long-term supply deals. Canada is diversifying markets in anticipation of U.S. volatility. Meanwhile, America is walking into the 2026 review with a slowing economy, high food prices, and farm communities exhausted from years of political whiplash. Canada is entering CUSMA calm and prepared. Trump is entering desperate for leverage. And the more he threatens potash, the more leverage he hands to Ottawa. This is the political irony. The states most loyal to Trump will be the first to feel the pain. Potash price spikes hit fertilizer. Fertilizer costs hit corn and soybeans. Higher feed costs hit livestock producers. And all of it hits rural families who already operate on razor-thin margins. When fertilizer spikes, grocery store prices spike too, and voters notice. This isn't a blue state problem or a red state problem. It's a national problem created by a president who keeps treating trade like a reality TV stunt. Democrats will weaponize it. Republican governors will panic. Farmers will revolt. And Canada will continue exporting potash while the U.S. experiences another self-inflicted crisis. Trump's threat to place new tariffs on Canadian potash is not just another trade skirmish. It is the second act of a story America should have already learned from. The soybean disaster of 2018 was the preview. The potash crisis of 2025 is the sequel. But this time, the damage won't be limited to one crop or one region. It will hit the entire food chain. Canada is not the antagonist in this story. Canada is the stable supplier, the responsible partner, and the adult in the room. The real crisis is that American farmers are being forced once again to pay the political price for Trump's tariff theatrics. And unlike 2018, there is no bailout big enough to replace the potash Canada provides. So the question isn't whether Canada can withstand a tariff. The question is whether American farmers can survive being used as bargaining chips one more time. And based on history, they can't.